coffee spilled on a $3,000 Persian rug. That was the exact moment she knew she had to leave. Not the whispered threats in dimly lit garages, not the midnight burner phone calls. It was the way Roman stared at the brown stain seeping into the wool like it was a personal betrayal. Harper walked away from a multi-million-dollar criminal empire because she couldn't stomach the sheer, exhausting narcissism anymore. 3 days later, her apartment floorboards vibrated. She looked out her window to find her entire street choked by an armada of matte black SUVs, 100 of them. Idling. Waiting. Bleach and burnt espresso. That was the permanent scent of the 64th floor. She stood in the corner of Roman's office, her tablet pressed so hard against her ribs that the plastic edge dug a painful line into her skin. The air conditioning was always set to a freezing 64 degrees. Roman claimed it kept everyone alert. She just thought it made the room feel like a morgue. Roman was sitting behind his massive oak desk, perfectly still. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than her college education, and he was staring at a mid-level distributor named Davis. Davis was sweating. The smell of Davis's nervous perspiration, sharp, sour, smelling faintly of cheap deodorant, was cutting right through the expensive room fragrance. "I asked for the shipping manifest on Tuesday, Davis," Roman said. His voice didn't rise. It never did. It was a low, even baritone that forced you to lean in, to strain to hear him, making you complicit in whatever terrible thing he was about to say. "I know, Mr. Rossi. The Port Authority. They held up the containers. It was a bureaucratic thing, I swear to God." Davis wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. Roman sighed. He picked up a solid gold paperweight. He didn't throw it. He just turned it over in his large, meticulously manicured hands. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. It was a power play, a cheap, psychological trick to make the other person unravel. She'd seen him do it 100 times. She used to find it fascinating. Now it just felt pathetic. She looked at Roman. Really looked at him. There was a smudge of ink on his thumb. He had a slight tension in his jaw, the muscle ticking rhythmically. He wasn't a god. He was a 34-year-old man with control issues who threw quiet temper tantrums when the world didn't bend to his exact, impossible specifications. "Harper," Roman said, not looking at her. "Yes," she answered, her voice sounding hollow in the vast room. "Call accounting. Tell them Davis is being transitioned out. Severance is to be withheld, pending an audit of his sector." Davis made a sound like a deflating tire. "Roman, please, I have a kid." "Get out, Davis," Roman interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were flat, a dull, dead brown. Not menacing. Just empty. Davis scrambled out, his shoes squeaking humiliatingly on the polished hardwood. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Silence returned, save for the low hum of the air purifier in the corner. Roman went back to reading a file, dismissing the ruin of a man's life with less thought than he gave to ordering his lunch. Her stomach gave a hard, ugly lurch. Acid burned the back of her throat. She looked down at her tablet. Her schedule for the rest of the day involved coordinating a bribe for a city inspector, ordering Roman's specific brand of alkaline water because the current batch tasted dusty, and firing the cleaning staff because one of them had moved his favorite pen 2 inches to the left. It wasn't the crime. It was the absolute, suffocating toxicity of his orbit. It was walking on eggshells for a man who demanded the universe cushion his every step. She set the tablet down on the glass coffee table. It made a sharp clack. Roman paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "Did I ask you to put that down?" "I'm done," she said. Her voice trembled. She hated that it trembled. She wanted to sound cold and resolute, like a woman in a movie. Instead, she sounded like a stressed-out assistant who hadn't slept a full night in 2 years. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to stand taller, ignoring the dampness under her arms. Roman slowly lifted his head, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Excuse me, I am giving my notice, effectively immediately." She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out the folded sheet of cheap 20-pound printer paper she'd drafted at 3 in the morning and placed it on the edge of his desk. It looked flimsy and pathetic against the heavy oak. He stared at the paper. Then he looked at her. A muscle feathered at his temple. "Is this a joke? Did someone offer you more money? If the Colombians are trying to poach you, Harper, you know how this works." "No one is poaching me," she said, her nails biting into her palms. "I'm just tired. I'm tired of the schedule. I'm tired of the yelling that isn't yelling. I'm tired of the fact that you expect me to care about your alkaline water while you ruin people's lives over minor inconveniences. The vibes here they're just toxic, Roman. I can't do it anymore." She actually said the word vibes to a cartel head. The absurdity of it tasted metallic on her tongue. Roman blinked. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and he just looked utterly, completely bewildered. "Toxic vibes. Harper, I run a syndicate. We traffic narcotics. We are currently at war with a rival family. And you are quitting because of toxic vibes?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate. There was no point. He wouldn't get it. He thought the danger was the hard part. The danger was easy. The micromanagement was what was killing her. "You can't just quit," he said, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. A threat. "I just did." She turned around. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. She expected him to shout. She expected the heavy thud of footsteps behind her, a hand grabbing her shoulder. She expected a gun to cock. Instead, there was only the soft scratch of his fountain pen resuming its path across the paper. She reached the door, pushed it open, and walked out into the sterile, brightly lit hallway. She didn't look back. She took the private elevator down 64 floors, the pressure popping in her ears, her breathing shallow and fast. When she hit the lobby, she pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the humid, garbage-scented street air. She took a deep breath. It smelled like exhaust and hot pretzels. It was the best thing she'd ever smelled. Her apartment was a shoebox on the 4th floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood where the gentrification hadn't quite taken hold. The hallway smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and old mop water. For the first 24 hours, she felt nothing but a manic, buzzing high. She scrubbed her kitchen counters until her knuckles bled. She organized her spice rack alphabetically. She ordered a disgustingly greasy pepperoni pizza, ate 4 slices over the sink, and slept for 14 uninterrupted hours. By day 2, the silence started to ring in her ears. She sat on her lumpy thrift store sofa, wrapped in an oversized fleece blanket that had begun to pill. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, a violent metallic rhythm that made her shoulders flinch every time it cycled on. She kept looking at her phone, a generic black rectangle sitting dead on the laminate coffee table. She hadn't turned it on. She knew she needed a new one, a burner, but the thought of walking down to the bodega felt insurmountable. The adrenaline crash was physical. Her bones ached. Her skin felt too tight. For 2 years, her baseline operating state had been hypervigilance. Her brain was wired to anticipate disaster, to read micro-expressions on the faces of killers, to manage the logistical nightmare of a volatile kingpin. Now, she was just Harper, a 26-year-old unemployed woman eating generic brand Cheerios dry out of the box. The crunching echoed in the small room, loud and grating. She got up and walked to the window. It overlooked a narrow street lined with parallel parked cars that had seen better days. Across the way, a neon sign for a laundromat flickered, casting a sickly pink glow over her living room wall. A shadow moved in the alley below. Her breath caught. She dropped to a crouch instinctively, her knee banging hard against the radiator. Pain flared, sharp and grounding, but she ignored it. She pressed her cheek against the cold, grimy plaster beneath the windowsill, peering out with one eye. It was just a stray cat, picking through an overturned trash can. She let her head fall back against the wall, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt ridiculous, pathetic. Roman wasn't going to send a hit squad because she quit. She was an assistant, not a capo. She knew his schedule, his preferred brand of scotch, and the passcodes to his petty cash accounts. She didn't know the routes, the offshore accounts, the real secrets. She wasn't a liability in that way. But she had dented his ego. That was the real danger. She remembered a time 6 months ago. A girl, a hostess at one of his clubs, had rejected his advances. She hadn't been rude, just firm. She had a boyfriend. 3 days later, she was fired. A week after that, her landlord evicted her due to a sudden, inexplicable plumbing issue that condemned the building. Roman had bought the property just to kick her out. He didn't do messy revenge. He did systemic, suffocating destruction. He altered the environment around people until they couldn't breathe. She stood up, rubbing her bruised knee. The fabric of her sweatpants felt rough against her skin. She went to the kitchen and turned on the tap. The water sputtered, coughing out a rusty brown liquid before running clear. She filled a cracked mug and drank it down. It tasted like copper and chlorine. She missed the filtered, crisp taste of the water at the office. The thought made her freeze. A wave of intense, violent self-loathing washed over her. She missed the water. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and she was mourning the quality of the birdseed. This was what he did to people. He made the outside world feel unlivable, dirty, chaotic. He convinced you that his sterile, terrifying control was the only safe place to be. No, she whispered to the empty room. She walked over to the trash can and dumped the rest of the generic cereal into it. She needed to get a grip. She needed to find a normal job. Maybe at a dentist's office, or a bakery. Somewhere the biggest crisis was a missing file or a burnt batch of scones. She walked into her cramped bathroom and turned on the shower. The water pressure was a joke, a pathetic trickle that barely warmed up. She stood under it for a long time, letting the tepid water wash over her, trying to scrub away the lingering phantom scent of expensive cologne and fear. Tomorrow, she would turn on her phone. Tomorrow, she would look for a job. She was out. She was free. She just had to survive the withdrawal. Tuesday morning started with a vibration. It wasn't a sharp jolt. It was a low, resonant hum. A physical sensation that traveled up through the cheap foundations of her building, through the warped floorboards, and straight into the mattress springs beneath her. She woke up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lay still, holding her breath, straining her ears. It sounded like a massive, collective purr. The sound of heavy machinery idling. Lots of it. She kicked off the tangled sheets, the cool morning air hitting her bare legs. The clock on the microwave glowed 6:15 a.m. It was usually quiet at this hour, save for the occasional rumble of a garbage truck. This was different. This was constant. She padded barefoot across the living room. The floorboards were genuinely vibrating beneath her toes. A prickle of unease crawled up the back of her neck. She reached the window, grabbed the edge of the cheap vinyl blind, and pulled it back an inch. The breath punched out of her lungs. Her street, a narrow two-lane road usually cluttered with beat-up sedans and minivans, was gone. In its place was a solid, unbroken river of matte black metal. SUVs, dozens of them. They were parked bumper to bumper, entirely blocking the road. They were on the sidewalks, crushing the few scraggly saplings the city had planted last spring. They spilled out of the alleyways and completely blocked the intersection at the end of the block. Escalades, Suburbans, G-Wagons, all identical. All with tinted windows so dark they looked like voids in the morning light. Plumes of white exhaust rose from their tailpipes, mingling in the cold air, creating a low-hanging fog over the street. The smell of burning diesel and hot rubber seeped through the poorly insulated edges of her window frame, sharp and toxic. She couldn't count them all, but she knew the number. She managed the fleet ledger. There were exactly 100 of these vehicles in the organization's primary reserve. He brought the whole fleet. Her stomach plummeted, a free fall of panic. She dropped the blind and stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She went down hard, jarring her tailbone against the floor. She didn't care. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the sofa. This wasn't a hit. You don't send 100 heavy-armored vehicles to a residential neighborhood to quietly kill an assistant. This was a spectacle. This was a siege. She crawled back to the window, keeping her head low, and peeked over the sill. The door of the lead SUV, a massive, custom-armored beast parked directly in front of her building's entrance, clicked open. A heavy leather boot stepped out onto the cracked pavement. Roman. He didn't look like the untouchable boss behind the oak desk. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans and a black, heavy-knit sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His hair, usually slicked back with meticulous care, was loose, a few dark strands falling over his forehead. He looked exhausted. There were deep, bruised shadows under his eyes, and the stubble on his jaw was rough, speaking of 3 days without a razor. He leaned against the hood of the SUV. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver lighter and a cigarette. He lit it, shielding the flame from the wind with a cupped hand. Roman hated smoking. He claimed it showed a lack of impulse control. She hadn't seen him smoke in the entire 2 years she worked for him. He took a drag, exhaled a long, thin stream of grey smoke, and then he slowly tipped his head back. He looked straight up, past the brick facade, past the rusted fire escapes, directly at her 4th-floor window. Even from this distance, even through the glare of the morning sun against the glass, she could feel the weight of his stare. It was heavy, possessive, and wildly, terrifyingly unhinged. Her front door buzzer rang. The sound was jarring, a harsh electric bleat that made her shriek, a short, pathetic sound she immediately hated herself for. She didn't move. She stayed crouched by the window, staring at the intercom on the wall. It rang again, a long, sustained buzz. She looked down at the street. Roman was still leaning against the car, looking up, holding a cell phone to his ear with his free hand. She looked at her own phone, still sitting dead on the table. The buzzer stopped. A moment later, she heard the heavy, muffled thud of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Plural. Heavy boots on cheap carpet. They didn't knock. "Harper!" a voice called out through the thin wood. It was Jimmy, Roman's head of security. His voice was thick, grating, and sounded deeply apologetic. "Harper, please just open the door. He's losing his mind down there. He hasn't slept. He hasn't eaten. He's practically holding the whole West Side logistics network hostage until you come back down." She stared at the peeling paint on her front door. Her heart was beating so fast it blurred her vision. "Tell him to leave, Jimmy," she yelled, her voice cracking on the last syllable. "You know I can't do that, kid," Jimmy called back softly. Look out the window. Does that look like a man who knows how to leave? He told me to tell you he fired Davis. He fired the cleaning staff. He ordered different water. He said to tell you he'll fix the vibes. Just open the door. She closed her eyes. The smell of diesel exhaust was thickening in her living room, choking out the scent of old cabbage. He had brought a war fleet to her doorstep. He was paralyzing a city block. He was terrifying her neighbors, breaking noise ordinances, and functionally deploying a private army because he didn't know how to apologize like a normal human being. It was the most toxic thing she had ever seen, and God help her as she sat on the vibrating floor of her miserable, cold apartment. A tiny, sick part of her brain felt a flutter of dark, terrible validation. She pushed herself off the floor. The linoleum felt sticky beneath her bare feet. She walked toward the door, her hand reaching for the deadbolt, knowing that if she turned it, the crash landing was over. And the real free fall was about to begin. Metal grated against metal as she turned the deadbolt. It was a heavy, ugly sound that echoed in the cramped hallway. She pulled the door open, the hinges whining in protest. Jimmy stood on her cheap welcome mat. He was a man built like a commercial refrigerator, poured into a tailored charcoal suit that strained across his broad shoulders. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint gum, stale coffee, and the sharp, undeniable tang of gun oil. He let out a breath he'd clearly been holding, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Thank Christ," Jimmy muttered, his gravelly voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not wearing shoes, Jimmy," she said. Her voice sounded entirely detached, as if it belonged to someone else standing 3 feet to her left. She looked down at her bare toes curling against the sticky linoleum, then at her faded, oversized grey sweatpants. Jimmy didn't even blink. "He doesn't care, Harper. You could be wearing a garbage bag and a sombrero. Just come downstairs. The neighbors are starting to peek through their blinds, and if a patrol car rolls by, I'm going to have to make a very messy phone call." She stared at him. He wasn't threatening her. He was pleading. Jimmy, a man who had allegedly broken a union boss's kneecaps with a tire iron, was looking at her with the wide, stressed eyes of a retail manager dealing with a catastrophic spill in aisle 4. "Fine," she breathed. She didn't grab a coat. She didn't grab her keys. She just walked past him, her bare feet padding softly against the threadbare hallway runner. Jimmy fell into step behind her, a silent, hulking shadow. The smell of boiled cabbage that permanently haunted her floor began to fade as they descended the narrow stairs, replaced by the choking, sulphurous stench of idling diesel engines. Pushing open the heavy glass door to the street was like stepping into an oven. The heat radiating from the gridlocked fleet of black SUVs was physical. It pressed against her skin, humid and metallic. The low, synchronized purr of 100 engines vibrated in her teeth. It was deafening, yet strangely quiet. No one was honking. No car alarms were going off. The entire street had been suffocated into absolute submission. Roman was still leaning against the hood of the lead Escalade. When the lobby door clicked shut behind her, his head snapped up. The cigarette fell from his fingers, hitting the cracked pavement. He crushed it beneath the heel of his heavy leather boot. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. The concrete was freezing against the soles of her feet, a sharp contrast to the heated air rolling off the engine blocks. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly hyper-aware of her ratty t-shirt and unwashed hair. Roman pushed himself off the hood. He walked toward her, his movement stiff, lacking his usual predatory grace. Up close, the damage was stark. The bruising under his eyes looked permanent, deep purple and sickly yellow. His cheekbones jutted out sharply under the rough, dark stubble. He looked like a man who had been starved and kept in a bright room for 72 hours. He stopped 2 feet away. The scent of him, usually a crisp, intimidating blend of cedarwood and bergamot, was undercut by the sour smell of stale adrenaline and unwashed clothes. "You didn't answer your phone," Roman said. His voice was a rasp, completely devoid of the smooth, chilling baritone he used to terrorize his subordinates. "My phone is dead, Roman," she replied, keeping her chin level. "And even if it wasn't, I quit. That means I don't answer your calls anymore." A muscle in his jaw jumped. He reached into the pocket of his dark jeans and pulled out a sleek, pristine white box. The shrink wrap caught the morning sunlight. It was the newest model, the one that hadn't even hit the retail stores yet. "I brought you a new one," he said, holding it out. His hand, usually so steady it was unnerving, had a microscopic tremor. She stared at the box. She wanted to laugh. It was a hysterical, bubbling pressure in her chest. "You brought 100 armored vehicles to my apartment building to give me a cell phone. I brought them because I didn't know if you were safe." His eyes, usually a flat, dead brown, were wide, frantic, searching her face. "You walked out. You didn't take your severance. You didn't take the car I assigned you. You just vanished into this." He gestured vaguely at her dilapidated building, genuine disgust curling his upper lip. "This place is a security nightmare, Harper. The fire escape is rusted. The lobby door doesn't lock properly, and there's a blind spot in the alley that a sniper could use to—" "A sniper?" She cut him off, her voice rising. "Roman, I'm an administrative assistant. The only people trying to kill me are my student loan providers. You are the only security nightmare on this street." He stepped closer, invading her space. The heat radiating off him was intense. "You aren't just an assistant. You know that. I know that. I managed your schedule and ordered your water," she whispered fiercely, refusing to back up, refusing to let him intimidate her on her own sidewalk. "You manage me," he corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate hum. "You know exactly how many milligrams of melatonin I need to not lie awake picturing the ceiling collapsing. You know which of my capos is stealing from the till because you read their micro-expressions in the boardroom. You buffer the noise. You keep the room at 64 degrees. I hated the cold," she confessed, the words tasting like ash. "I was freezing for 2 years, Roman." He blinked, thrown entirely off balance. It was a tiny detail, but it shattered whatever script he had running in his head. You were cold?" "Yes." "And the vibes," she reiterated, feeling the absurdity of the word again, but clinging to it because it was the only thing that made sense. "The energy. The constant, crushing fear that if I handed you a blue pen instead of a black one, you'd ruin someone's life. I can't live in that atmosphere. It's poison." Roman stared at her. He looked at her bare feet on the freezing concrete, then up to her messy, uncombed hair. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Jimmy," Roman barked, not breaking eye contact with her. "Yeah, boss," Jimmy answered instantly from behind her. "Turn the engines off." "All of them?" Jimmy asked, hesitant. "Every single one," Roman snapped. "And tell them to clear the block. Go park in the industrial district. I don't care. Just get them out of here." Jimmy pulled a walkie-talkie from his belt. Within 5 seconds, the deafening purr of the armada began to die. It happened in waves, engine after engine cutting out, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. The exhaust fumes began to dissipate in the morning breeze. Roman looked back at her, his chest heaving slightly. "The cars are gone. I'll change the thermostat. I'll drink tap water. Just get in the car, Harper. Please." He said the word please. A man who ordered executions with a flick of his wrist was begging her on a dirty sidewalk in Queens. She looked at the massive black SUV sitting by the curb. The door was open, revealing an interior of plush, cream-colored leather. It looked like a vault. It looked like a prison. It looked familiar. She hated herself in that exact moment. She hated the weak, codependent knot in her stomach that unraveled at the sight of his desperation. She knew it was manipulation. She knew his vulnerability was just a different kind of weapon. But the sheer gravity of his obsession pulled at her, a dark, terrifying undertow. "I need my shoes," she said softly. Roman closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping his lips as his forehead rested briefly against the roof of the SUV. "Jimmy will get your shoes. Get in the car." The ride back to the tower was silent. The city blurred past the heavily tinted windows, reducing the chaotic morning commute to a muted, grey smear. She sat in the back, her ratty sneakers, retrieved by a very confused Jimmy, tucked under the seat. Roman sat opposite her, staring out the window, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle looked like it might snap. When the private elevator doors slid open on the 64th floor, the difference was immediate. The air didn't bite. It was warm, almost stiflingly so. She stepped out onto the Persian rug, the stain from 3 days ago meticulously scrubbed away, though a faint, ghost-like shadow remained if you knew where to look. The heavy, oppressive silence of the office was broken by a soft, melodic hum. She looked toward the corner. The industrial air purifier, the one that sounded like a jet turbine, was gone. In its place was a small, aesthetic humidifier, puffing a gentle stream of lavender-scented vapor into the air. Roman walked past her, shedding his heavy knit sweater and throwing it carelessly onto one of the Barcelona chairs. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt underneath, the cotton clinging to the rigid muscles of his back. He walked to his massive oak desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the blotting pad was a crystal carafe filled with water. Normal, unfiltered, flat tap water, judging by the slight cloudiness. She stood in the center of the room, feeling entirely untethered. 72 degrees, Roman said, turning to face her. He pointed a finger at a digital thermostat on the wall. Jimmy changed it yesterday, sweated through his suit. But it's 72. She wrapped her arms around herself. You didn't have to do that. You said you were cold, he replied, his tone defensive, almost aggressive in its compliance. You said the environment was toxic. I'm fixing it. The heavy oak door opened with a soft click. A woman walked in, carrying a stack of leather-bound ledgers. It was Maria, one of the mid-level accountants. She took 2 steps into the room, saw her standing there in her sweatpants, and froze. Her eyes darted to Roman, panic flashing across her face. The smell of her fear was instant, a sharp, acrid spike in the warm, lavender-scented air. "Mr. Rossi," Maria stammered, her knuckles white around the ledgers. The offshore routing numbers. You asked for them by 9. Roman turned slowly. The vulnerability he had shown on the street vanished, replaced by the flat, dead stare that terrified her. "Did I ask you to enter without knocking, Maria?" Maria swallowed audibly. "I knocked, sir." "I thought I heard—" "You thought wrong," Roman cut in, his voice low, vibrating with a dangerous tension. He took a step toward her. The predator was back, triggered by a minor infraction, desperate to exert control over something after surrendering it to her. "Roman," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cracked through the room like a whip. He stopped. He didn't look at her, but his shoulders visibly stiffened. "She knocked," she lied smoothly. "I heard her. I told her to come in." Maria looked at her, sheer terror warring with desperate gratitude in her eyes. Roman remained motionless for 3 agonizing seconds. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, exactly like the old days. She felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She had just countermanded him in front of a subordinate. In his world, that was a lethal offense. Slowly, Roman turned his head. His eyes met hers, dark and searching, looking for a challenge. He found none. Just a weary, resolute exhaustion. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He turned back to Maria. "Leave the ledgers on the table. Then go." Maria practically sprinted to the coffee table, dumped the books, and fled the room, shutting the door quietly behind her. Roman walked over to his desk, poured a glass of the cloudy tap water, and drank it straight down. He grimaced slightly, the taste clearly offending him, but he set the glass down with a sharp clack. "There," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Gentle. Understanding. Non-toxic." He sounded furious. He sounded like a caged animal trying to play house. She walked over to her desk in the corner. Her computer was exactly as she had left it. Her highlighters were color-coordinated in their acrylic cup. She sank into the ergonomic mesh chair. The cushion was cold. "This isn't going to work," she said quietly, booting up the monitor. The blue light washed over her face. "It will work," Roman snapped, pacing behind his desk. "I fired Davis. I got rid of the guys who were lingering in the break room. I told Jimmy that anyone who raises their voice above 50 decibels on this floor gets relocated to the docks. I am sanitizing the perimeter." She closed her eyes, a dull headache pulsing behind her temples. "Roman, you can't enforce a positive work environment through terror. Threatening to break someone's legs if they don't smile at me isn't fixing the vibes. It's just a different kind of hostage situation." He stopped pacing. He leaned both hands heavily on his oak desk, staring at her across the expanse of the room. "Then tell me how to do it." It wasn't a demand. It was a plea, entirely stripped of his usual armor. She looked at him. The most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard, a man who orchestrated millions of dollars in illicit trade, was asking his unshowered, underpaid assistant how to act like a human being. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But start by sitting down. You're making me nervous." For a moment, she thought he would argue. Instead, he slowly lowered himself into his high-backed leather chair. He folded his hands on the desk. He sat perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She pulled up the day's schedule. She began deleting the retaliatory firings he had initiated in her absence. She reinstated the cleaning staff. She ordered a crate of his ridiculous alkaline water. They sat in silence for 3 hours. The room was warm. It smelled of lavender, and the tension was so thick she could have carved it with a knife. She was no longer an assistant. She was the warden, and she had no idea how to keep the monster in check. 4 days into the new regime, the cracks began to show. The office felt like a pressurized cabin miles above the earth. On the surface, it was serene. The temperature stayed at 72. Voices were kept low. People walked softly. But beneath the floorboards, you could feel the structural integrity groaning. Roman was decaying. Without his usual outlets for micromanagement and petty tyranny, the stress of running a criminal syndicate was eating him alive from the inside. He wasn't sleeping. She knew this because her new burner phone, the one he'd given her, would light up with red receipts at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 5:30 a.m., as he reviewed encrypted files. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was the color of bruised iron, threatening rain. She was drafting a dummy contract for a shell company when Jimmy walked in. He didn't knock. He didn't do the polite, hushed entry Roman had mandated. He burst through the door, his face pale, his suit jacket flapping open to reveal the dark, matte grip of his sidearm. The smell of ozone and copper followed him in, the sharp, metallic scent of fresh violence. "Boss," Jimmy said, his voice a harsh bark that shattered the lavender-scented peace. Roman was out of his chair before Jimmy finished the word. The lethargy of the past 4 days vanished, replaced by an explosive, terrifying kinetic energy. "What?" Roman demanded, crossing the room in 3 strides. "The Volkovs," Jimmy panted, handing Roman a cheap, cracked burner phone. The plastic casing was smeared with something dark and tacky. Blood. "They hit the staging area at Pier 44. 3 of our guys are down. They took the shipment. All of it." The air in the room froze. The temperature might have been 72 degrees, but a sudden Arctic chill radiated from Roman's body. He stared at the bloody phone in his hand. She stood up from her desk slowly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had been shielding herself from this reality. She had been playing office politics while ignoring the fact that the company produced corpses. Roman didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He went perfectly, unnervingly still. It was the same stillness he had used with Davis before, destroying his life, but magnified 100 times. The whites of his eyes showed all the way around his dark irises. The muscle in his jaw wasn't ticking. It was locked tight, pulling his face into a terrifying skeletal mask. 3 dead, Roman whispered. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Yes, sir," Jimmy said, taking a subtle half-step backward. "They left a message. Said the west side belongs to them now." Roman slowly curled his fingers around the bloody phone. The plastic casing groaned, then cracked loudly under the immense pressure of his grip. Tiny shards of black plastic fell to the expensive rug. "Get the tactical teams," Roman said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Round up every man we have in the reserve. Burn their safe houses. I don't want a negotiation. I want the Volkovs erased. I want their families erased. I want the ground they walk on salted so nothing ever grows there again." "Roman," she said. Her voice was shaky, a thin reed in a hurricane, but she couldn't stop it. The sheer scale of the violence he was ordering made the room spin. Roman's head snapped toward her. For a split second, he looked at her like he had never seen her before. He looked right through her, seeing only blood and fire. The monster wasn't in a cage anymore. It was loose, and it was starving. "Quiet, Harper," he snarled, a visceral, animal sound. "This isn't about vibes. This is war." He turned back to Jimmy. "Arm everyone. Tell them." "No." She stepped out from behind her desk. Her legs felt like water, but she forced herself to walk toward him. "Jimmy, wait outside." Jimmy looked at Roman, then at her, entirely torn. "Get out, Jimmy!" Roman roared, the sound deafening, rattling the glass of the window panes. Jimmy flinched and bolted, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. They were alone. Roman was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He looked wild, unmoored. The bloody phone was still crushed in his fist, the sharp plastic digging into his palm, drawing a thin line of his own blood that dripped onto the floor. "You don't understand," Roman choked out, stepping toward her. He raised his bloody hand, pointing a trembling finger at her chest. "They took my men. They think I'm weak. They think because I'm sitting up here drinking tap water and playing nice, I've lost my teeth." "I understand," she said, keeping her voice low, steady, forcing a calm she didn't feel. She stopped 3 feet from him. The smell of the blood on his hand was strong, metallic and sickeningly sweet. "No, you don't," he shouted, scrubbing his clean hand through his hair, leaving it standing on end. He paced like a caged tiger. If I don't slaughter them, they will come here. They will come to this building. They will come to your apartment, Harper. You think the toxic environment was bad before? Wait until the Volkoffs start blowing up the lobbies. He wasn't acting out of pure malice. He was acting out of terror. The control freak had lost control, and his only recourse was to burn the world down to re-establish the boundaries. She looked at his bleeding hand. The sight of it made her stomach roll, but she forced herself to step forward. She reached out. Her fingers hovered for a second, trembling, before she gently wrapped her hand over his clenched, bloody fist. Roman flinched violently, as if she had burned him. His breathing hitched. He stared down at her pale hand, covering his dark, blood-stained fingers. His skin was ice-cold. The rigidity in his muscles was like touching carved stone. "Roman," she said softly, stepping into his space. She tilted her head up to look into his frantic, blown-out eyes. "You are going to fix this, but you are not going to slaughter families. You are not going to start a street war that burns down half the city. You are smarter than them. You don't react. You maneuver." He stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The manic energy in his eyes was battling with the grounding weight of her touch. "They killed 3 of my guys," he whispered, a crack of pure, agonizing vulnerability breaking his voice. "I know," she said, her thumb stroking the back of his rigid knuckles, smearing the tacky blood against her own skin. "And you will handle the people responsible, but quietly, surgically, like the man who runs this city, not a thug with a gun." She felt the exact moment the tension broke. A shudder ripped through his massive frame. The bloody plastic phone dropped from his grip, hitting the rug with a dull thud. He swayed forward, his forehead coming to rest heavily against her shoulder. He didn't hug her. He just collapsed his weight against her. A silent, desperate surrender. She could feel the rapid, chaotic hammering of his heart against her chest. The smell of blood and old adrenaline surrounded her. She stood there in the quiet office, bearing the weight of a murderer, her own hands stained with the blood of his world. She had stopped a massacre, but the realization was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. She wasn't managing his schedule anymore. She was managing his soul, and she was absolutely terrified that she was beginning to like the dark, twisted power of it. Roman had listened to her. He didn't send the tactical teams to burn down the Volkov safe houses. He didn't order a blind, roaring massacre in the streets. He had taken a shuddering breath against her shoulder, stepped back, and let the cold, calculating strategist take over. The ensuing 48 hours were a masterclass in silent, suffocating violence. She didn't see the bodies. She saw the spreadsheets. She sat at her desk in the 72-degree, lavender-scented office, staring at a high-resolution monitor. Her fingers, still faintly trembling, clicked across the keyboard as she wired $400,000 from a shell corporation in the Caymans to an anonymous holding account. The memo line read, "Environmental Remediation Services." It was the cleanup crew. 2 Volkov lieutenants were dead. Found in a parked car under an overpass, the scene entirely sanitized, stripped of any forensic evidence connecting it back to Roman's syndicate. The men responsible for hitting Pier 44 had simply ceased to exist, deleted from the board with terrifying, surgical precision. There was no collateral damage, no grieving civilian families, no stray bullets shattering neighborhood windows. It was exactly what she had asked for. It was clean, and it made her want to throw up. The heavy oak door opened, breaking the unbearable quiet of the room. Roman walked in. He had showered. He was wearing a fresh, charcoal-grey suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. The wild, blood-soaked manic energy from 2 days ago was entirely gone. His dark hair was meticulously combed back. His jaw was cleanly shaven. He smelled of crisp cedarwood and sharp bergamot. He looked like a CEO. He looked like the man she had worked for before. The cracked veneer exposed the starving animal beneath. He walked over to his desk and stopped, looking at the carafe of tap water. He didn't pour a glass. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto her. "The routing numbers cleared," she said. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight over a hollow drum. "The environmental team confirmed receipt. The Port Authority has been compensated for the disruption. The ledger is balanced." Roman didn't blink. He walked around his desk, bypassing his high-backed leather chair entirely. He crossed the Persian rug, his footsteps making no sound, until he was standing directly in front of her desk. He placed both hands flat on the edge of her workstation, leaning down until his face was level with hers. The proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his throat, right above the perfect knot of his silk tie. "It's done," Roman said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. It was the voice he used when a hostile negotiation had been successfully terminated. "The Volkovs pulled their men back across the river. They sent a mediator this morning. They want a truce." "A truce?" she repeated, staring at his perfect, manicured hands. She couldn't stop picturing them crushed around a bloody piece of plastic. "Because of you," he murmured, leaning a fraction of an inch closer. "If I had retaliated the way I wanted to, they would have dug in. It would have cost millions. It would have cost lives. You saw the angle I couldn't see." "I didn't see an angle, Roman," she shot back, a sudden, bright flare of anger piercing through her nausea. She looked up, meeting his dead brown eyes. "I just didn't want you to murder innocent people to soothe your bruised ego." The muscle in his jaw ticked, a flash of the monster, there and gone in a microsecond. "It wasn't my ego," he corrected softly. "It was fear." The honesty was a physical blow. It knocked the breath out of her lungs. Roman didn't admit fear. Men in his position died when they admitted fear. It was blood in the water. "You managed me," he continued, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, dropping to her neck, and then rising back to meet her gaze. "You put a leash on a rabid dog, Harper. You kept the room clean." "I don't want to be your leash," she whispered, gripping the plastic edges of her armrests so hard her fingers ached. "Too late," Roman said. "It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of absolute, inescapable fact." He pushed himself off his desk, straightened his suit jacket, and walked back to his chair. He sat down, the leather sighing beneath his weight. "Jimmy packed your apartment," Roman said casually, opening a leather-bound file on his desk. Her brain stalled. "Excuse me?" "The rusted fire escape, the broken lobby door, the stray cats in the alley," Roman listed, not looking up from his reading. "It's a security risk. The Volkovs know who you are now. They know you're the reason I didn't burn their houses down. Some of them might be grateful. Some of them might see you as my only vulnerable flank. You aren't staying there anymore." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. "You can't just pack up my life without asking me." Roman slowly closed the file. The thwap of the leather cover echoed in the quiet room. "Harper, you came back to fix the toxic environment. You don't get to dictate the security protocols. You live in the penthouse upstairs now. The elevator codes have been keyed to your fingerprint." He was doing it again. He was altering the environment. He was shrinking her world until it solely consisted of him and the air he allowed her to breathe. But this time, she wasn't just an assistant watching from the corner. She was the linchpin holding his sanity together. And they both knew it. cardboard boxes looked incredibly sad, sitting on imported Calcutta marble. Jimmy had piled her meager belongings in the center of the penthouse living room. Her faded, lumpy thrift store pillows were stacked precariously against a sleek, modernist leather sofa that probably cost more than a luxury sedan. Her cheap, generic brand spices were boxed up on a kitchen island that spanned 10 feet of flawless, unblemished quartz. The penthouse took up the entire 65th floor. It was entirely encased in glass, offering a dizzying 360-degree view of the city's glowing skyline. It was beautiful. It was a terrarium. She stood in the center of the room, still wearing her office clothes, hugging her arms tightly against her chest. The air up here was perfectly climate-controlled. Unobtrusive vents breathed a silent, steady stream of 68-degree air. No lavender. Just the crisp, sterile smell of money and isolation. The private elevator dinged softly. The heavy steel doors slid apart. Roman stepped out. He had discarded the suit jacket and the tie. His collar was unbuttoned, and the cuffs of his shirt were rolled up to his forearms, exposing the thick, roped muscles and the edge of a dark, sprawling tattoo that crept up his left wrist. He carried 2 heavy crystal tumblers and a bottle of amber liquid. "Macallan, 25-year," he said, walking toward the kitchen island. He set the bottle down, poured 2 generous measures, and pushed 1 tumbler across the quartz. "You look like you need it." She didn't move toward the glass. She glared at him. "I want to go home, Roman." "You are home," he replied effortlessly, taking a sip from his glass. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring the burn, before looking back at her. "The building is secured by 40 armed guards. The glass is ballistic rated. You have a private chef on call." "It's a cage." "It's a vault," he countered, his voice hardening. "And you are the most valuable thing I have in it." He walked around the island, stepping over a box containing her cheap paperback novels. He stopped a foot away from her. The smell of the scotch, peaty, smoky, and rich, mixed with the heat radiating off his body. "I can't breathe when you do this," she said, her voice shaking. She hated that it shook. She wanted to scream, to break the beautiful crystal glass against the marble floor, but the exhaustion was a physical weight dragging her down. You suffocate everything you touch. You fixate and you control and you crush it until it stops moving. Roman stared down at her. The shadows in the penthouse were long, cast by the ambient glow of the city lights outside. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. "I know," he whispered. The admission fractured the tension in the room. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air before slowly, agonizingly, settling on her waist. His fingers dug into the fabric of her pencil skirt. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a grip. A desperate, drowning man clutching at a piece of driftwood. "I don't know any other way to keep things," Roman said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, broken rasp. He pulled her half a step closer. The heat of his chest radiated through his thin dress shirt. "Everything I have ever let run loose has either betrayed me or died. I can't let you run loose, Harper. I will lose my mind." She looked up into his eyes. They were wide, dark, and utterly stripped of the boss, the kingpin, the monster. He was just a terrified, broken man who possessed too much power and not a single shred of peace. "You're toxic," she breathed, her hands rising instinctively to rest flat against his chest. She could feel the heavy, frantic thud of his heart against her palms. "I know," he repeated, his head dipping lower, his forehead resting against hers. Their breath mingled, tasting of expensive scotch and raw panic. "You ruin people." "I will never ruin you," he swore, his voice a jagged edge. I will burn this entire city to ash before I let anything leave a scratch on you. That was the problem. He meant it. His love, his obsession, his gratitude, it was all weaponized. It was a localized nuclear strike disguised as affection. She should have pushed him away. She should have walked to the elevator, punched in the code, and disappeared into the night. But her hands didn't push. Her fingers curled, clutching the expensive cotton of his shirt. The contradiction tore her in half. She despised the cage, but the sheer, overwhelming gravity of being the center of this terrifying man's universe was a dark, intoxicating drug. She felt vital. She felt powerful. She held the monster's heart in her bare hands. He didn't ask for permission. The remaining distance vanished. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't romantic. It was a collision. Teeth clashed. A sharp sting of pain followed immediately by the searing heat of his tongue. He dropped his tumbler. The heavy crystal hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, the aged scotch splashing against their shoes. He didn't care. He wrapped both arms around her, lifting her off the floor entirely, burying his face in her neck. He kissed her like he was trying to consume her, to absorb her into his bloodstream, so he would never have to worry about her walking out a door again. She kissed him back. She kissed him with all the pent-up frustration, the fear, the exhaustion of the last 2 years. She dug her nails into his shoulders, tasting the smoke of the scotch on his tongue, matching his desperate violence with her own dark, yielding surrender. The smell of spilled alcohol and ozone filled the air. They stumbled backward, his heavy boots crunching over the broken crystal, until her back hit the ballistic glass window. The cold pain bit through her thin blouse, a shocking contrast to the suffocating, burning heat of his body pressing against hers. She was drowning in him, and God help her, she stopped trying to swim to the surface. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a flat, grey drizzle that smeared across the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city into a blurred, weeping watercolor. She woke up tangled in sheets made of silk so fine it felt like water against her skin. The massive California king bed was empty. She sat up, the cool air of the penthouse washing over her bare shoulders. She dragged a hand through her tangled hair, her mouth dry, tasting faintly of smoke and regret. Her clothes from yesterday were folded meticulously on a velvet armchair in the corner. Next to them sat a small, square black velvet box. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The thick wool rug absorbed the sound of her bare feet. She walked over to the chair and picked up the box. The hinge was smooth, entirely silent as she opened it. It wasn't a ring. It was a heavy, matte black keycard, embossed with a silver insignia. Beneath it was a small piece of heavy stock paper. Roman's handwriting was sharp, jagged, and aggressive. Master access, every floor, every account, every door. They are yours. She stared at the black plastic. It wasn't just a key. It was a surrender. He was handing her the reins to the empire. He was giving her the power to lock him out, to drain the accounts, to walk away with everything. It was the ultimate, terrifying proof of his obsession. He was handing the warden the keys to the armory. She walked into the massive marble-clad bathroom. The shower was a glass box the size of her old living room. She turned the water on scalding hot, stepped inside, and let it beat down on her aching muscles. As the steam rose, choking the air, she finally stopped lying to herself. She didn't want her lumpy thrift store sofa. She didn't want the smell of boiled cabbage in the hallway. She didn't want a generic job at a dental office where the biggest crisis was a misfiled chart. She had tasted the adrenaline. She had watched a man who commanded an army of killers fold himself into a trembling wreck at the mere threat of her absence. She had stopped a war with a whisper. The power was of venom, and it was already circulating in her bloodstream. She got out, dried off, and dressed in the clothes he had folded for her. She slipped the heavy black keycard into her pocket. It sat against her thigh, a cold, dense weight. She took the private elevator down to the 64th floor. The doors opened to the familiar scent of expensive air purifiers and terror. The floor was bustling. Men in sharp suits walked with quiet, frantic purpose. Jimmy was standing by the reception desk, looking at a tablet. When she stepped out, the entire floor froze. The conversations died. The ringing phone seemed to muffle. Every pair of eyes snapped to her. They looked at her differently today. She wasn't the assistant who fetched the alkaline water anymore. She was the woman who had walked out, caused 100 black SUVs to paralyze a city block, and walked back in carrying the boss's sanity in her pocket. Jimmy swallowed hard, nodding respectfully. "Morning, Harper." "Morning, Jimmy," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It sounded remarkably like Roman's, low even, demanding absolute attention. She walked past him, the click of her heels echoing in the absolute silence. She pushed open the heavy oak door to Roman's office. He was sitting behind his desk. He was wearing a stark white button-down shirt, no tie. He looked up the second the latch clicked. The exhaustion was still there, but the manic edge was gone. He looked settled. He looked like a man who had anchored himself to a rock in a hurricane. She walked across the Persian rug. She didn't stop at her small desk in the corner. She walked straight to the wall panel next to the heavy drapes. She reached out and pressed the digital interface. Beep. 68 degrees. Roman watched her, his hands folded patiently on his blotting pad. He didn't say a word. She turned around, walked to her desk, and sat down in the ergonomic mesh chair. She booted up her monitor. She opened the day's schedule. There were 3 meetings with capos, a routing issue at the docks, and a shipment coming in from Miami. "The Miami distributors are asking for a higher cut," Roman said softly, testing the waters. "Deny it," she said, not looking away from the screen. "Tell them they absorb the shipping costs, or we find a new distributor. We hold the port. They need us more than we need them." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. "Send the message," Roman ordered, his voice thick with a dark, vibrating approval. She clicked the mouse, sending the email. She looked up across the expanse of the room, meeting the flat, dead brown eyes of the man who ran the city. The vibes were still toxic. The air was still thick with the threat of violence, the scent of expensive cologne, and the crushing weight of systemic crime. But it was her room now, and the monster belonged to her. Harper didn't just survive the toxic environment. She became the architect of it. She walked out of that building as a hostage and walked back in as the warden, realizing that sometimes the most dangerous power is the kind you never asked for. If you loved this dark, grounded dive into obsession, control, and the terrifying gravity of a toxic romance, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that don't sugarcoat the shadows. Share this video with a friend who loves a truly morally grey protagonist, and sound off in the comments if you would have taken that black keycard.